Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking all about boosting your English fluency. We're going deep into the Master English podcast to uncover those like sneaky mistakes, even like, experienced learners make, and of course, how to fix them. Think of it as a shortcut to sounding more natural and confident, whether you're using English for work, travel, or just for kicks, you know?
Yeah. And what's really cool is that the podcast doesn't just like focus on dry grammar rules. It digs into the psychology of language learning, like how our brains are wired for our native tongue and the mental hurdles we need to overcome to like truly master English.
I loved that part. It's like,
Yeah,
okay, no wonder I keep making that same mistake. It's not just me being silly, it's my brain clinging to its old habits.
exactly.
Mm.
And understanding those mental processes is key to finding strategies that actually work. Speaking of which, the podcast kicks off with a topic near and dear to my heart, pronunciation, specifically the dreaded word stress.
Ah, yes, word stress. Like,
Mhm.
why does comfortable have to be so uncomfortable to say?
Well, it all boils down to English being a stress-timed language.
Yeah.
Imagine a song with like strong beats and weaker beats. That's kind of how English works. We emphasize certain syllables in a word and others get shortened or mumbled.
Mm.
But if your native language isn't stress-timed, your brain doesn't automatically do this and it throws off the entire rhythm of your speech.
Hmm. That makes sense. It's like we're trying to dance to a different beat.
Right.
But how do we get our brains and our tongues in sync with the English rhythm?
Well, the podcast suggests a technique called shadowing, and this is where the brain science gets super interesting. Shadowing basically means mimicking native speakers. You listen closely and try to copy their pronunciation and intonation almost simultaneously.
Yeah.
And by engaging in this active imitation, you're not just training your tongue. You're actually activating multiple areas of your brain, building muscle memory and auditory processing skills.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about parrot-like repetition, there's real cognitive power behind it. I remember trying this with a British podcast once, and it was surprisingly effective. I even started picking up on those subtle British inflections, which is a fun bonus.
That's a great example of how shadowing can work. It also brings up a crucial point. When you enjoy the process, your brain is more engaged and you learn faster.
Definitely. Now, the next pitfall the podcast tackles is something I think we've all experienced. Direct translations. That moment when you translate a phrase word for word from your native language and it just sounds weird.
Oh, absolutely. Like
Yeah.
the classic example they gave translating I am 30 years old directly from Spanish, which ends up being something like I have 30 years. It's grammatically correct, but it sounds very unnatural to a native speaker.
And why do our brains do that?
Yeah.
It's like they're stuck in their native language comfort zone.
It's all about efficiency.
Mm.
Your brain defaults to what it knows best, which makes sense, right? But to truly speak English fluently, you need to shift your thinking process.
You mean actually think in English?
Precisely. And it's not as daunting as it sounds. The podcast suggests journaling in English. Even short entries can help you get used to forming thoughts directly in the language. And over time, you'll notice that you're not translating as much in your head. You start to internalize English sentence structures and patterns.
That's so cool. It's like you're rewiring your brain to think in a new language. Speaking of rewiring our brains, let's tackle another huge one, prepositions. Those tiny words like in, on, at, they can be a real headache.
Oh, absolutely. The podcast used the example of saying good in English instead of good at English. And this is where the concept of collocations comes in.
Collocations. Okay, I'll admit I need a little ELI 5 on that one.
Think of it this way. Collocations are words that naturally go together in English, like make a mistake or take a break. You wouldn't say do a mistake or catch a break, even though the meaning is similar. Prepositions often work like this. They form these little word partnerships that might not make logical sense on their own.
So it's not just about memorizing prepositions in isolation, it's about learning them as part of these natural phrases. I remember struggling with prepositions for ages, and then one day it just clicked when I started noticing them in context.
That's exactly it. It's all about those aha moments. And speaking of moments of clarity, let's move on to another topic that often trips learners up. Articles. Those tiny words a, an, and the,
Yeah.
that can totally change the meaning of a sentence.
Right, like I went to school versus I went to the school. Subtle but crucial.
Absolutely. And while there are basic rules for articles, mastering them really comes down to exposure and practice. Pay attention to how native speakers use them in movies, TV shows, even everyday conversations. Your brain will start to pick up on those patterns over time.
It's like learning by osmosis. Speaking of observing native speakers, let's talk verb tenses. I feel like that's where a lot of English learners get tangled up.
Verb tenses are definitely tricky, especially since English has so many of them. The podcast gives the example of, I've seen him yesterday, which is incorrect. The correct form would be, I saw him yesterday. But what's fascinating is that research has shown that learning verb tenses through stories can be much more effective than rote memorization.
Really? That's interesting. Why is that?
Well, stories provide context, which helps our brains remember information more easily. Think about it, when you're reading a story, you're not just focusing on individual words or grammar rules. You're immersed in the narrative, experiencing the events unfold, and the verb tenses naturally fall into place.
That's such a cool way to think about it. It's like you're watching a play and the verb tenses show you the timeline of the action. You see how the past, the present, and the future all connect.
Exactly. And the podcast suggests actively noticing those verb tenses as you read. So instead of just passively absorbing the story, take a moment to think about why a particular tense is being used. It's like adding a little mental workout to your reading routine.
I love that. It's about being an active learner, not just a passive reader. Okay, now let's move on to a word that often causes confusion even for advanced English learners.
To. Ah, yes, the to versus very dilemma. The podcast highlights how saying I am too happy often implies something negative in English. It's like you're suggesting you're excessively happy, maybe even to the point of being annoying or out of control. Whereas I am very happy is a straightforward way to express a high level of happiness without any negative connotations.
It's one of those subtle cultural nuances that can really trip you up.
Precisely. And it's a good reminder that language isn't just about grammar rules. It's also about understanding cultural context.
So in general, it's safer to stick with very unless you're deliberately trying to convey that sense of excess.
Exactly. And that brings us to another aspect of sounding more natural in English: contractions.
Ah, contractions. Those little time savers that make all the difference in spoken English.
They really do. Using contractions like don't instead of do not, or I'm instead of I am, makes your speech sound smoother and more natural. Native speakers use contractions all the time in casual conversation.
It's like the difference between a robot and a real person talking.
Exactly. So embrace those contractions. Don't be afraid to let your speech flow.
I love that. It's all about sounding authentic. Speaking of authenticity, I think we all agree that using a variety of words spices up our speech, right?
Absolutely. The podcast encourages going beyond those basic adjectives like good or bad and expanding your vocabulary. Instead of saying this book is good, you could say this book is captivating or thought-provoking.
It paints a much more vivid picture in the listener's mind. And speaking of vivid pictures, have you ever noticed how some English learners make word order mistakes in questions?
Oh, definitely. The podcast gives the example of how you are instead of how are you. It's a common mistake because many languages have a different word order for questions. But in English, we follow a specific pattern: question word plus auxiliary verb plus subject plus main verb.
It's like a little formula. So in how are you, how is the question word, are is the auxiliary verb, you is the subject, and doing, implied, is the main verb.
Exactly. And once you understand that formula, forming questions correctly becomes much easier. Practice makes perfect, as they say.
Now, let's wrap up this section with a topic that I think is crucial for clear communication: speed and rhythm.
It's so important. Speaking too fast or too slow can make it difficult for listeners to understand. The podcast suggests using a metronome app to practice speaking rhythmically.
A metronome, like the thing musicians use.
Yes. It might sound strange, but it can actually help you find a comfortable pace and avoid rushing or unnatural pauses. Think of it like finding the beat of the English language.
That's such a cool idea. It's like you're dancing with the words.
And when you find that rhythm, you sound more confident and engaging.
This deep dive is already blowing my mind.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much we can learn from just one podcast episode. It feels like we're getting a crash course in the science of language learning.
It really is fascinating how much psychology and brain science is involved, isn't it? And the Master English podcast does a great job of breaking it all down in a way that's easy to understand and apply.
Absolutely. It's not just about memorizing rules. It's about understanding the why behind those rules, which makes them stick so much better.
Exactly. Like we discussed earlier with Thinking in English, it's about gradually rewiring your brain to process the language more naturally. And as you continue to immerse yourself in English, you'll find that you start to think in the language more and more often without even realizing it.
That's the dream, right?
Yeah.
to reach that point where English just flows effortlessly. It reminds me of that aha moment we talked about with prepositions and collocations.
Right.
Once you start noticing those natural word pairings, it's like a whole new level of understanding unlocks.
It's like you've cracked the code. And that's why the podcast emphasizes learning English in chunks, not just isolated words. So instead of memorizing a list of prepositions, focus on learning phrases and sentences that use those prepositions naturally.
So it's about understanding the music of the language, those rhythms and patterns that native speakers use instinctively, which brings us back to that metronome tip, using it to practice speaking rhythmically. It's like finding the beat of English, just like a dancer finds the rhythm of the music.
I love that analogy. It really captures the essence of fluency. It's about finding that natural flow and cadence. And just like with dancing, the more you practice, the smoother and more effortless your movements become.
Speaking of practice, the podcast also mentioned the benefits of watching movies and TV shows in English. I have to admit, that's one of my favorite ways to learn. It feels less like studying and more like entertainment.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic way to immerse yourself in the language and absorb those subtle nuances of pronunciation, intonation, even cultural expressions. It's like a cultural deep dive in itself.
And you can pick up so much vocabulary and slang that you might not find in textbooks. Plus, you get exposed to different accents and speaking styles, which is great for developing a more well-rounded understanding of English.
And it's fun.
Yes.
Let's be honest, learning a language should be enjoyable. And when you're genuinely engaged and entertained, your brain is much more receptive to new information.
I totally agree. It's all about finding those learning methods that spark your interest and keep you motivated. Speaking of motivation, the podcast also talked about the power of reading in English. I know for me, reading has been such a crucial part of my language learning journey.
It's invaluable. Reading exposes you to a wider range of vocabulary, sentence structures, and grammatical concepts than almost any other method. And you can learn at your own pace, pausing to look up unfamiliar words or reread passages as needed.
It's like having a personal English tutor at your fingertips. Plus, there's something magical about getting lost in a good book, even if you have to look up a few words along the way.
And with so many amazing books and online resources available, there's something out there for everyone, no matter your interests or reading level.
Now, I want to circle back to something that really intrigued me. The idea of learning verb tenses through stories. It just makes so much sense. You're seeing those tenses in action in a context that's engaging and memorable.
It's like watching a play unfold, as you said earlier.
Yeah.
The characters, the plot, the dialogue, it all comes together to create a dynamic narrative that showcases how verb tenses work in real-life situations. And because you're emotionally invested in the story, those tenses are much more likely to stick in your mind.
It's like learning by osmosis. I remember struggling with the past perfect tense in English for ages, and then one day I was reading a novel and it just clicked. It was like, oh, that's how it works.
Right.
I get it now. And it's all because I was immersed in the story, not just memorizing grammar rules in isolation.
That's the beauty of learning through context.
Yeah.
It becomes less about rote memorization and more about organic understanding.
And it brings us back to that key takeaway. Fluency is a journey, not a destination.
Right.
It's about constantly exploring, experimenting, and finding those learning methods that work best for you.
And celebrating every little victory along the way.
Oh, definitely.
Every new word you learn, every conversation you have, every book you finish, it's all progress.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about embracing the process and enjoying the ride. And that's something the Master English podcast really emphasizes. Finding joy in the journey of language learning.
And remembering that every mistake is an opportunity to learn and grow.
Absolutely. It's about having that growth mindset and believing in your ability to achieve fluency.
And never losing sight of the amazing rewards that come with mastering a new language, connecting with people from different cultures, expanding your worldview, and unlocking a whole new world of possibilities.
Now, before we wrap up this incredible deep dive, I want to touch on something we mentioned earlier, the cultural side of language. It's not just about words and grammar. It's about understanding those subtle cultural nuances that can make all the difference in how you're perceived.
It's like learning a secret code. And cracking that code can help you communicate more effectively and avoid those awkward misunderstandings that can sometimes happen when cultures collide.
The podcast gave that great example of to versus very, how using to express a positive emotion can sometimes come across as negative or excessive in English, even though it might be perfectly acceptable in other cultures.
It's a subtle but important distinction. and it highlights the importance of paying attention to how native speakers use language in different contexts.
So how can English learners become more aware of these cultural nuances? It seems like it would be tricky to pick up on just from textbooks.
It's definitely something that's best learned through experience and observation. Watching movies and TV shows can be incredibly helpful, as we discussed earlier, but also try to immerse yourself in real-life English conversations as much as possible. Listen to how people speak, what kind of language they use in different situations, and how they express themselves nonverbally.
It's like becoming a cultural detective.
Exactly. And it's a fascinating journey of discovery. The more you learn about the cultural nuances of English, the richer and more meaningful your interactions with native speakers will become.
And the more you'll appreciate the incredible diversity and complexity of the language itself.
It's truly a lifelong learning process.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive into the world of English fluency. It's amazing how much we've unpacked from just one podcast episode. We've gone from pronunciation and those pesky prepositions to the science of thinking in English and those fascinating cultural nuances.
Right. And it all boils down to this idea of active learning, finding those strategies that resonate with you and help you make meaningful progress.
Exactly. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's about finding what works best for you and creating a learning environment that feels engaging and enjoyable.
And the Master English podcast gave us so many great starting points.
It really did. But as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question inspired by the podcast. If our brains naturally default to our native language, what are some creative and fun ways to truly immerse ourselves in English and make that mental shift to thinking in the language?
That's a fantastic question. It's all about finding ways to integrate English into your daily life, even beyond the traditional methods we've discussed.
So beyond watching movies and reading books, what are some other ways to create that immersive experience?
Well, think about those little moments throughout your day where you could switch to English.
Okay.
Change the language settings on your phone and computer.
Uh,
Listen to English music and podcasts while you're commuting or exercising.
yeah.
Even something as simple as switching your social media feeds to English can make a difference.
It's like creating little pockets of English throughout your day.
Exactly. And you'd be surprised how quickly those little pockets add up.
It's all about those micro moments of exposure, right? Those tiny interactions that gradually train your brain to think in English.
Precisely. And it doesn't have to feel like a chore. In fact, it can be really fun to turn it into a game.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, for example, you could try the English challenge. Give yourself a set amount of time each day, maybe 30 minutes or an hour, where you only speak, read, and write in English.
Mm-hmm.
You can watch an English TV show, listen to an English podcast, read an English article, or even write a journal entry in English.
That's a great idea. It's like a mini immersion program you can create for yourself, and it would force you to really think in English since you wouldn't have the option of falling back on your native language.
Exactly. It's a way to challenge yourself and step outside of your comfort zone. And the more you do it, the easier it will become.
What are some other creative ways to immerse yourself in English?
Think about your hobbies and interests. Is there a way to incorporate English into those activities? For instance, if you love cooking, start following English language recipe websites or YouTube channels.
That's such a good idea. It's about finding those natural connections between your passions and the language you're learning.
Exactly. If you love music, listen to English language songs and try to sing along. If you're into gaming, switch your game's language settings to English.
Those are fantastic tips. And what about those of us who are more visual learners? Are there any strategies that might be particularly helpful?
Absolutely. Visual learners can really benefit from using flashcards or creating visual dictionaries. You can write down new words and phrases on index cards and draw pictures or use visual cues to help you remember them.
I love that idea. It's about tapping into that visual memory to reinforce your learning.
And don't forget the power of sticky notes. Label objects around your house with their English names. Every time you walk past that lamp, you'll see the word lamp, and it will reinforce your vocabulary.
It's like turning your home into a giant English learning lab.
And speaking of labs, think about creating your own English zone in your home. It could be a corner of your living room, a desk in your bedroom, or even just a comfy chair. Fill that space with English books, magazines, movies, music, anything that inspires you to learn and practice.
I love that idea. It's your own personal English sanctuary, a place where you can escape and immerse yourself in the language without distractions.
And don't forget the power of community.
Yeah.
Surround yourself with other English learners and native speakers.
Mm.
Join a language exchange group. Attend English conversation meetups. Or find online communities where you can connect with fellow learners from all over the world.
It's amazing how technology has made it so much easier to connect with people who share your language learning goals, no matter where you are in the world.
Absolutely. And those connections can be so motivating and inspiring.
This has been such an incredible conversation. I feel like we've covered so much ground, and I'm walking away with a ton of practical tips and strategies to apply to my own English learning journey.
It's been a pleasure diving into this topic with you. And remember, the key to fluency is consistency, curiosity, and a whole lot of fun.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there who are on their own English learning adventures, keep exploring, keep practicing, and most importantly, never stop believing in your ability to achieve your goals.
And remember, the world is full of fascinating people and cultures waiting to be discovered through the power of language.
Yes.
So go out there and connect.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of English fluency. Until next time, happy learning.